Okay, well, let me welcome all our viewers to our first SIGHPC education broadcast of the year. I just wanted to remind those of you that are members that a number of you have your membership due by the end of October. I know it's an onerous amount, $10 a year, but hopefully you can still afford it and will renew. And that lets us do some things as a chapter. Also, note that this will be the first in a series of webinars. We're going to try to ramp up and do approximately one per month on a variety and have a variety of educators and trainers from a variety of fields relating to HPC give background information on their programs. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Tracy Teal and Greg Wilson, who will talk about both data and software carpentry. So Tracy, I'm going to turn this over to you.
Great. Thanks, Stephen. We're really excited to have this opportunity to be a part of this series. So I'm gonna share my slides. Screen share here. There we go. Look good? Am I good?
You're good.
I'm good. Terrific. Okay. Yeah. So this program and what you're doing, Stephen, is terrific and really in line with the kinds of things that we're thinking about. So we're happy to be a part of this series and for you to have built this community. So pay your dues. I think they usually buy cookies. Isn't that right? So what we're here to talk about today is software and data carpentry and training to enable more effective computational research. So I'm going to let you know a little bit of the motivation for what we're doing, which I imagine you share, what our approach has been and what we've been doing so far. And Greg is going to talk about some of the lessons learned and next steps for the program. So I'm the executive director of Data Carpentry, and we're a newer organization, but part of that is motivated by this data deluge. So data is increasing in volume, velocity, and variety. So this is, I'm sure, something that you are very familiar with. We're getting more data, so sort of this larger volume. We're having real-time data, streaming data, the velocity of data coming through is increasing. And the variety of data. We're getting not only things like structured tables, but images and text and genomic data. So a lot of unstructured data in all different types from different domains or even within domains. This large-scale data is being generated across these different domains. Just these being some of these. And it's relevant in the research space, but also in the non-academic sector, so in business, analytics, and marketing, finance, healthcare, they're all generating these extremely large volumes of data. So our motivation is to enable effective research, but these kinds of skills are also important for our researchers if they decide they want to apply these strategies in other industries. So with the emergence of these new technologies generating these large data sets in all the domains of research, data analysis and software development is no longer the domain of specialists and is instead widely done by all researchers. So we sort of tried to think about what's different now than it was, say, 10 years ago, right? Astronomers have been dealing with large data sets for years. A lot of people dealing with large images, even MRIs. Why is now different? Why is the HPC community starting to see a lot of different researchers come use their resources that they hadn't worked with before? And it is because of this pervasive amount of data in all of these different domains being generated by different types of machines, different types of people. So it's so pervasive now that people who traditionally haven't needed these computational skills to do their research now need these skills and these strategies and these just sort of this way of thinking about data. So we do have all of this data, and it's terrific, and it has a lot of potential for helping us make discoveries and answer questions, but that's all it is right now, is data potential. And so we need to be able to turn this data into the answers to research questions. It's only information until we're able to apply our strategies and bring researchers' perspectives to bear on this data. But what's missing in turning this data from just data and its data potential into the answers to research questions is training. So researchers don't yet have these skills or these strategies for dealing with their data. And this isn't something that we're just saying. This is, in fact, something that's really motivated by the researcher community. In a survey of the Bioinformatics Resource Australia, when they asked what was their biggest bioinformatics difficulty, they said expertise and training, much more so than things like storage or compute or even funding, surprisingly. When does that ever happen? And the most useful things that this bioinformatics organization could do would be to offer training and access to expertise. Again, much over compute power and access to data. And some of the reason that there might be this disparity about compute is that actually researchers don't know that they need the compute resources yet. They're just starting to get engaged with their bioinformatics analysis and aren't aware of the limitations that their laptop has, for instance. So some of it is not even knowing what resources they'll need to do their work. So software and data carpentry are working to fill that training gap. And our goal is to provide researchers high-quality training covering the fundamentals and best practices in software development and the full life cycle of data-driven research. So I'm going to go a little into the background of how these were founded, but just as an overview, software carpentry teaches basic lab skills for scientific computing so that researchers can do more in less time and with less pain. Data carpentry teaches the basic concept skills and tools for working more effectively with data. Our workshops are designed for people with little to no prior computational experience. So this sort of pool of researchers that haven't typically worked with data or computational resources. This is a grassroots training effort, sort of labeled grassroots, because it's really motivated. This isn't a top-down. This is really motivated by the people who are engaged in the researchers. So the lessons are developed by practitioners for practitioners instead of top-down identifying what kinds of skills need to be taught. The researchers, the people working in these domains, are identifying the skills and best practices needed in software development, data management, and analysis in a given domain. All the lessons are collaboratively and iteratively developed, and they're openly licensed. They're all CC BY. They're all available on GitHub. And then we organize and deliver 2-day intensive hands-on workshops in fundamental data analysis skills and software development using a pool of volunteer helpers and instructors. And Greg is going to touch on the instructor pool and the instructor training strategies. So these are 2-day intensive hands-on workshops. People are working at their computers through the whole workshop, so they're structured that will sort of introduce a concept, go through that concept with people, and then give them an exercise to work through on their own. All the instructors go through a qualification program to learn how to teach with this strategy and in this workshop format. We have helpers for all of these workshops that are also volunteers that will go and support the instructors and go help people individually when they run into problems. We use Post-it notes to communicate when exercises are done, green sticky notes when things are going well, your exercise is done, red sticky notes when you run into a problem so that a helper can come over you and help you. So it's really effective strategy for communicating during the workshop between instructors, helpers, and participants. So why are we doing these workshops? The reason that we're doing these workshops is that the curriculum is full. So I'm sure you're aware it's very difficult to get a new course into a college program. There's so many courses already. And developing a new course takes time, and finding instructors and deciding what you want to leave out of the curriculum if you're putting something new in. Researchers don't necessarily have a lot of time to learn these skills. They can't take 6 months off and go to one of these training schools, or even necessarily take one of these courses if they were offered. These workshops allow for focused attention and collaborative learning. So again, all of our materials are online. People could just go do self-guided learning with these materials, and many often do. But this focused attention, so bringing people together for a couple days and being able to really focus on these skills, really makes a difference. This collaborative learning, that people are helping each other, and that people get feedback immediately during the workshop, so they're not sort of working on their own and then ask a question and 3 hours later get a response. This real-time feedback on strategies and how they're doing is really effective. And the other really great aspect to these workshops is that we're building a community. So at an institution, when people come together for these workshops, they're working together, but they're also building a community that will persist after the workshop. And we're working on that piece a little bit more, and we'd love especially to talk with the HPC education folks about how we could integrate workshops into sort of HPC educational strategies to sort of continue learning after the workshops, or have the workshops be a part of a continued learning program. So a little bit of background, that's sort of where we are and what we're doing now. And so this has been around since 1998. Greg Wilson co-founded it, and then sort of rebooted in 2013. And since then, it's scaled to teach over 440 two-day workshops for over 11,000 learners, taught by over 300 volunteers in 20 countries. So this is just a map of the United States. So these are North American workshops just from 2012 to 2014. The software carpentry curriculum, just to get a little more detailed about the differences between the workshops and the skills being taught. So software carpentry was developed because Greg was working with researchers who were self-taught programmers, and he can correct me about this, but he saw that they were not using good software development practices. So people were writing code but weren't using functions, weren't using version control, and he knew that researchers could be a lot more effective if they used a lot of these standard software development best practices, and not only be effective but be more reproducible, right? Be able to reproduce their work, share it with others, and so that would really level up the software development community in scientific software. And so he built these workshops to be able to teach those skills to researchers. So the curriculum currently is command line, so using the command line, automation at the command line. Software development best practices. Right now, I think the workshops, there's R, Python, and MATLAB. So these are teaching, again, sort of, comment your code and how to write functions, and even how to do loops. Sometimes that's something that people miss sort of when they're being self-taught. And also, very importantly, GitHub for version control. We started out with Subversion, but as the world has moved to GitHub, now software carpentry workshops teach GitHub for version control. Data Carpentry, again, is this newer organization, and so where software carpentry teaches people who already have some experience with software development, we started to see that there were a lot more people coming to the software carpentry workshops that wanted to learn to program, and that is, I think, because of this great increase in data and people knowing now that they really needed to learn some programming skills. And so we designed these workshops specifically for people without much prior experience. And so they are focused on sort of zero entry. So the goal of the workshops is to teach skills, but also to sort of demystify these processes and make them a little less scary. They're really intimidating when you sit down and start to try and figure things out yourself. So we're trying to affect both skills and attitudes about computational training. They're focused on data, so sort of how do you get from sort of point A, which is your unstructured data, to point E, which is a visualization of your data. And our workshops are domain specific, so we find that people learn best when they're learning in their own domain because the data set they have is relevant to what they're working on right now. So they can immediately sort of understand why they would want to use these skills and then apply them more directly in their own context. We've taught about 30 workshops in 2015 so far in ecology, biology, and are now starting to run ones focused on genomics data. We're developing lessons for geospatial data and for social sciences. And our curriculum, it is dependent on domain because we're trying to match the skills we teach with the domain as well as the data sets. But generally, we're teaching data organization and project setup, so that's structuring your data so that a computer can read it, and good sort of project setup practices, data cleaning and open refine, an introduction to data analysis and visualization in R or Python. In the ecology biology, we're teaching SQL for data management. In social sciences, we're teaching text mining. In the genomics lessons, we are teaching introduction to cloud computing, an introduction to the command line, because you need to be able to use those to do any kind of bioinformatics analysis. And on the cloud computing side, we are working with Amazon AWS, so that's our default cloud computing infrastructure that we're using. We have a snapshot there that we have users use throughout the workshop and then point them at educational resources. But we're also working with HPCs so that they could use their own HPCs as that piece of the lesson. So at Harvard, Bob Freeman with ACIREF ran a workshop using the Harvard HPC resources rather than AWS. So it's sort of, we're making these lessons modular so that you could plug in your own cloud computing resources to this part of the workshop. So sometimes I skip this because it takes a little bit, so I will actually come back to this and show a lesson at the end just to show you what they look like. Well, I'll do it now. Oops, I can't copy out of here. Just a second. So as I said, these are all collaboratively developed and all on GitHub. So we use the github.io, so things are written sort of in Markdown and rendered through Jekyll. And so here's an example lesson. So this is the one on the Unix shell. So there's some motivation for the lesson, the prerequisites, the things you need to do to prepare, then each of the topics. And so you can see, let's look at our pipes and filters. There's the learning objectives. And then there's all these different sections of the commands that you would write, little notes, and then you can see down at the bottom fancy images, these and exercises. So here are some of the exercises in the lessons for people to work through. So the great thing about these is, so these are notes for instructors on how to teach, but then there are also lessons that are available to people after the workshop. And so we're finding people really like that feature because they often don't get everything the first time through. They want to be able to refer back to it and not have to, write down a bunch of commands as they go along through the workshop. So these lessons themselves are a great resource during and after the workshop. We're also finding that people are taking these lessons and using them in their own workshops. Like they just want to teach a shell, for instance, as a part of some other lesson. They'll just use the software carpentry shell lesson for their teaching. So these lessons actually have a lot of uses in and out of the workshops. So we do know that we can't teach everything in 2 days, alas, but the goal is to teach these foundational skills to reduce the activation energy for getting started. So people now know how to get started, even how they can ask questions, where to look for resources, And mostly to know what's possible. So I said at the beginning that bioinformatics researchers are saying they don't need compute because maybe they don't know yet the kind of computational resources required for their analysis. In data cleaning, people will say, one of my favorite comments for the Open Refine lesson is that I was so excited to see about this tool, and then I was so sad because I realized all of the time I'd wasted doing it by hand. And so a lot of these things that we're teaching people are things that they can even envision were possible to do with the computer. So it opens up the possibilities for the types of research they can do and the kinds of analyses they can do with their data. The demand for these workshops is extremely high. We teach them internationally, taught over 100 this year, consistent demand across all these different domains. That's basically one of our struggles, is to meet that demand and that meet capacity. And overall, we've had good positive outcomes. Our assessment right now is still based on short-term assessment, so right after the workshop rather than long-term, which we're working on. But we do see things, this is just a sample survey, so a level of data management analysis prior to the workshop and after the workshop, so there's always a range, but in general we see higher, much higher. And they feel that these workshops are worthwhile. I mean, we're asking for 2 days of people's time who are busy. So we want to see if they're gaining practical knowledge and if this workshop was worth their time. So generally, they feel that they're gaining practical knowledge, things that they can use right now, and that this workshop overall was worth their time. The other thing that we're trying to change is attitudes about best practices. So, right, like software carpentry is trying to change thinking about version control and code use. And so changing attitudes is just as important as affecting skills. So this is a bad graph. So this is from a recent workshop. So a couple of the questions: data organization is a fundamental component of effective and reproducible research. So now 18 people strongly agree. Using a scripting language like R or Python can ultimately improve my analysis efficiency. 12 strongly agree, 6 agree. Using R or Python makes analyses easier to reproduce. Trending in the positive direction there. And a value of using programming languages, R, Python, SQL, is that we can't accidentally change the data, right? So we're emphasizing that point about raw data raw. So thoughts about data and software best practices are also being affected by these workshops. Sort of as a final note on how we're developing lessons, software carpentry is sort of focused on the software development, so they're sort of expanding lessons in terms of language or building skills and keeping those up to date with the most recent packages in R and Python. In data carpentry, we're expanding into new domains, and so the way that we are doing that is that we're running hackathons to develop these lessons. So we have 3-day workshops, basically, where people apply to help develop these workshops, and they come together and we spend a few days identifying skills, writing lessons, and so we did that for genomics, and I can talk a little bit more about that specifically if there are questions. We're doing one for the geospatial data, working with NEON. The genomics one, we worked with iPlant, the Cold Spring Harbor Labs, the Sync, and iDig Bio. And social sciences is a little bit, we don't have a hackathon scheduled yet, sort of a broader group. But we are learning how to run hackathons to develop lessons, which has been interesting and really useful too. So I'm going to turn it over to Greg. One of the things that I didn't talk about is this instructor. I said there were over 300 instructors who taught these lessons, and they're all volunteers. And so obviously there's a big component to training those instructors and managing and working with those volunteers. And so Greg's going to speak to that, the volunteer helpers here, and some of the lessons that we've learned over time. And I'm newer to this than Greg is, so Greg has a great perspective on what we've learned, what we want to do better, and how we're moving forward as the landscape sort of continues to change. So I'll take questions at the end after breaks then.
Let me, this is Steve, just let me say that if the audience has questions, if you will use the Q&A button on the broadcast, we'll accumulate those and address them at the end. And Greg, why don't you just go ahead then?
There, I'm
Okay.
gonna stop. I'm gonna stop sharing. There we go. All right, you're up, Greg.
Okay, and I have just screen shared. Can you see my slides?
Yep.
Okay, so thank you very much, Tracy. You covered pretty much everything. So here's what I've got. As Tracy said, when Brent Gordon and I kicked this off in the 1990s, it was partly in self-defense. We were both doing support programming for the application scientists, and over again, we would see them trying to run before they could walk. We would see them stumbling on parallelizing a 250,000 line Fortran code because they were emailing each other files that may or may not have been changed and then trying to assemble it again on some other machine. They'd never been shown version control. We would see people spend an hour a day in a rolly chair wheeling from one workstation to another to launch data analysis jobs because nobody had shown them how to write a for loop in the shell. And we didn't feel that we could help them make effective use of high-performance computing gear, as it was in the mid-1990s, if they couldn't meet us halfway, if they didn't have some of those basic skills. And what we've learned in the 17 years since then has only reinforced that. And let me give you just one example. Okay. I should probably put this into full screen mode. There we go. So here's a classic result from empirical studies in software engineering. The researchers who actually go and watch what programmers do. We've known for 40 years that code inspection, code review, is the most time-effective way to find bugs in code. That it's more effective than writing tests, that it's more effective than fuzzing. Having somebody else read your code carefully can remove 60 to 90% of errors before the first piece of code is run. That's a great finding. We've known for about a decade now, the work of Jason Cohn and others, that the first review and the first hour matter most. That if you're reading code for more than about an hour, you get tired and you stop noticing anything except superficial bugs. Similarly, if you can have 2 or 3 or 4 people read the code, the bugs that the second and third and fourth reviewer will find are actually overlapped with the ones that the first reviewer found. It's probably not cost effective in most circumstances to have more than one reviewer. Now, clearly, if you're doing multi-threaded garbage collection or if this is a security critical patch, then you throw the extra eyeballs at it. But for routine tasks, you really just need one reviewer. And then we found out in a couple of studies that we did last year and the year before that if you want scientists' code reviewed, some of the things from the standard software engineering literature don't apply. In particular, scientists don't want to wait until the code is done and then have it reviewed. They want it reviewed before they go off and run it and produce all of their results. So waiting until the paper is submitted along with the code and then doing the review at the same time as you review the paper isn't helpful to the scientists. At the same time, having highly skilled professional programmers review their code isn't particularly useful unless those programmers happen to have a background in the science and can understand what it's doing. Because if you don't understand hydrodynamics, you can't effectively review a piece of code that is supposed to do hydrodynamic simulations. If you don't understand phylogenetics, you can't review a phylogenetic clustering code. You can look for superficial things like indentation and meaningful variable names, but you're not going to catch the algorithmic or structural errors that are really important. So what we've got is a case of the blind leading the blind. Scientists don't have this particular skill. They don't do code review today, so they can't review each other's code, but because they can't, and because having professional web developers, for example, the sorts of programmer that I grew up to be, do the review isn't helpful, around and around we go. So how do we break out of this? And the solution is we have to grow our own. The first wave of instructors that we recruited for software carpentry 5 years ago, when we rebooted the program, were people who had come through workshops themselves. They were people who showed up to learn, and it quickly became obvious that they already knew most of what we were saying. So we'd pull them out and turn them into helpers. and then turn around and say, great, now you help us teach the next one. And that was the genesis of our instructor training program. Initially, it was very ad hoc. When we were a small operation, I could co-teach with everyone who wanted to become an instructor, and they would learn by example how we present this. But of course, that doesn't scale. So when we began to formalize instructor training 3.5 years ago, we wanted to introduce people to evidence-based teaching practices, not just the content of our lesson on the shell, but why is it structured that way? And we need them to have that partly so that they will be more effective in the classroom, but partly also so that they will understand when to improvise and how to improvise. As Tracy alluded to in her presentation, the audience that we get is tremendously diverse. You will have people who've never interacted with a computer textually. They've never typed a command at a computer. And then you will have people who have been sysadmins in the sort of ad hoc, unofficial way that grad students sometimes become the departmental sysadmins. And they're all in the same room together. So if you walk in as an instructor, yes, we've got lessons, and yes, they've been tried out in the field by dozens of other people, but every class is going to be unique and distinct. So you need to be able to modify what you're saying and how you're saying it on the fly. And our teaching practice, in particular live coding, encourages you to do this. So we want people to have a foundation in modern good teaching practices so that they'll feel comfortable doing that kind of improvising. And after a lot of experimentation, what we've settled on is a training course that runs a couple of hours a week for 8 to 12 weeks, depending on how hard we cram, or that we do in 2 full days. And some things that work well in one format work less well in the other. Both have their strengths and weaknesses. For example, the longer form, where people are working online over the course of multiple weeks, gives people the chance to reflect more on the lessons, do more prep work, and talk to each other more, which has all sorts of benefits. The advantage of the live version is that people can actually do demo lessons right there in front of each other and get real-time feedback, and there's a lower dropout rate because, as we all know, if something stretches over 12 weeks, the odds are pretty good that at some point during those 12 weeks, the server's going to catch fire, or there's going to be a deadline with one of your papers, or a kid is going to be sick, or something is going to force you to drop out. 2 days, there's much less of a risk surface. So there are ups and downs with both, but the core content is the same. And what we have been seeing over the last 1.5 years is an ever-increasing number of people who are coming to us who want to learn the teaching practices, even if they don't intend to apply it in a software carpentry or data carpentry workshop. They're intending faculty careers, or they're intending to go into some role in industry where training might be part of what they do, and they have the feeling that they ought to be able to do it better. And because they are scientists, because they've been trained to follow the evidence, they tend to respond very well when we say, here is the evidence that shows that active learning outperforms passive learning. Here's the evidence that shows that modeling the learner's mental state before you start building the lesson results in a better lesson. Here's the evidence that shows that working backwards from how you're going to tell if the learning took place to what are you going to teach also produces better lessons, and so forth. So all of this training is, we think, producing a better classroom experience for our learners, but it is also, again, as Tracy alluded, helping to build a community. The people who teach for us have all gotten to the same point at least once, so they can talk to each other about teaching practices, which naturally leads to conversation about what is your research and what kinds of tools you're using and a whole host of other things, but it gives them something in common. Of the 459 people who've qualified as instructors over the last 5 years, I would estimate that about half are active in the sense that they will teach when there's a workshop in their area, that they will respond to surveys, that they've given us a biography and they update it occasionally as they move around. And that's a pretty good hit rate compared to most of the open source projects that I've been part of. And if I can give a plug for this, the book to go to if you want to learn what we actually know about education and learning is called How Learning Works. It comes out of a group at Carnegie Mellon. It's a beautiful example of secondary literature. Every few pages says, here's another idea, here's what we know about how it works in practice, here are links to the primary literature if you want to go and dig, here's how certain or uncertain we feel about it, and then it moves on to the next topic, and the next, and the next. It's a beautiful summary of the state of the art as of about 2010. And it could well be that in the long run, a large part of our impact is not just the computing skills that we give people, but the fact that we show them that it is possible to teach better, and that it's more than just a matter of opinion, that the evidence behind better teaching is as solid as the evidence behind many public health measures like vaccination. And I'm really excited to see people who've come through instructor training with us applying those ideas in other contexts. The other thing, I'll come back to that slide in a second. The other thing we're seeing, though, is larger and larger collaboration on the development of lessons, and this is something that I hope we can transfer over to other communities like HPC. Software Carpentry actually published its lessons a month ago, and between the beginning of January and the end of August, those lessons had 187 contributors. And the contributorship distribution looks exactly like that of an open source software project. There's a handful of people who make frequent large contributions, who do the large-scale refactoring, for example. But then there's a very large number of people who make small fixes. They tidy up a grammatical mistake, they correct an error in an example, they make a better diagram. I struggle to find any sort of lecture material or training material, either in academia or in the corporate world, that has had 3 digits of contributors. And I think part of why it's happened is that we are showing people how to use things like Git and GitHub to collaborate on software. We're then using that tool to host our lessons, so it's very natural for them to take the skills they got for building software and applying it to these other documents that just happen to be the explanation about how you should be programming. And I don't know what that means in the long run, but clearly that way of working can be transferred over to the development of other teaching materials. We know, for example, that there's as many different batch queuing systems as there are people who write batch queuing systems. I mean, there's a large number of tools out there, but the basic principles are the same. Can we get distributed groups like Exceed, like ACIREF, like the staff at Compute Canada or at NESI in New Zealand to collaborate on construction and maintenance of lessons so that everybody's moved ahead with less effort from any individual, in the same way that they collaborate on building numerical libraries or web programming frameworks or tools like that? So far the indications are yes, and we'd really like to engage your community to see if we could, for example, build a lesson on performance tuning or on basic use of high-performance computing facilities with a large number of contributors. And as a last note, we've got some thanks to all of the people who have funded our work over the years, but the people who deserve it most right now are the steering committees. These 7 individuals were elected in January to be the steering committee for Software Carpentry. They are my boss collectively, and these 7 are the steering committee for Data Carpentry. And this is a sign that we have become a grown-up open source community project. It's no longer me or Tracy or any other individual. These things have scaled to the point where they are being run collectively and are stronger for it. And we think that's a really hopeful sign for the future. So just to close off, these are the organizations that have been supporting Data Carpentry. We're very grateful to all of them. These are the organizations that currently support Software Carpentry. We've had support from other groups in the past. They're listed on our website. And with that, I will close this off and hand back to our moderator, please.
So if you haven't posted a question, there is one question which I'll get to in a minute, but if you haven't posted a question, this is the time to do that by clicking on the Q&A button on the viewer, and we'll get to those questions as they come in. Please note that there is some time delay between what we broadcast and when we receive the questions, just because of the technology. The one question that was posted is from John Mosier, and he asks, are these classes being promoted to and or attended by small businesses, or is it primarily attended by academic users?
Greg, do you want me to take it?
Please.
So we are piloting workshops for companies. We've run a few so far at actually larger companies, just because those have been the people that have asked. We're not sure if we're going to continue that strategy, but we're trying it out. It has benefits. We do charge companies more money for workshops. Another advantage is it gives instructors the opportunities to engage with people in industry if they're looking at those for career options. So there are some advantages, but also some extra logistics.
Yeah. And we've had some of our instructors from Software Carpentry go and teach privately, either with our materials directly or with a modified version. We had one of those just 3 weeks ago, actually, and we fully support that. All of our materials are under a Creative Commons license. We really like it when people pick them up and use them in these ways. And as with open source, if somebody can take this material and make a living from it, it gives them a stronger reason to commit to it. So we'd like to see people doing that.
There are just guidelines about whether you call it a software carpentry
Sure.
or a data carpentry workshop.
Yep.
So have you given any thought to taking any of your materials and aside from having the published version online, actually have other instruction, like instructional videos online, or have you done any of that yet?
Oh, yeah. Can I take this one, Tracy?
Of course.
So I spent 12 months recording and editing instructional videos for the previous version of the Software Carpentry materials in 2010-2011, and then stopped for two reasons. The first is that if you make the video available and also make the text available, the code, transcripts and so forth, what you will see is that most of those videos are never watched by anybody. What people want to do is go and do a search to find the chunk of explanation that will help them with the problem they currently face. And then maybe they'll watch a bit of the video, but only if they can't understand the explanation. And this is consistent with what groups like edX are seeing, that most of their videos, people stop watching at the 60-second mark, if not before. The second reason we stopped is that the maintenance headache on video is killing us. If I see an error in a slide, I go in, I edit the slide, I re-export as PDF, I upload, we're done. It took 3 minutes. There's nothing you can do to fix a bug in a video that takes less than half an hour, no matter how small the change is. And until the maintenance cost for video comes down, I just don't think they're economic to do for anything other than showing people things about tool use that just don't translate into text. For example, how to set a breakpoint in a debugger. Now, I know a lot of instructors feel differently about this, but honestly, watching somebody talk in front of a whiteboard is much less efficient for me than reading through the description of what they were going to say. Tracy?
Yeah, I think where we might, we've been talking about videos, is videos to show instructors how to teach concepts, because that's something that's easily communicated via text. This idea of scaling Greg, not everyone can teach with Greg, but they could watch a video of him teaching a small concept. Again, short, no one wants to watch an hour. Not that you wouldn't want to watch an hour of Greg, but just, it's hard to watch.
You really
an hour. And so I think that's a place where we're thinking about video. But what we are trying to think about is how we can scale these teaching strategies beyond workshops. As we said, the demand is high. We can't get everywhere either. It's harder, to get to Brazil or Ecuador or, to start building up communities there. How
Nebraska.
Can we deliver workshops in winter, right? Right. How can we build up communities there? And so something that we have done is that we've taught workshops in one location and then had a remote site that had helpers in in the room with them. So still a workshop in the other location. So sort of running 2 workshops at the same time in different locations. And we've done that with 2. Effectively, it might work to do more. We've actually been talking with Exceed about running one through their Exceed training network in that way. So that might be a way to effectively scale things. But right, the completion rate for MOOCs is 10%, 5%, something low. So it's just a very different experience for learners. And we are trying to think about how we could sort of replicate the workshop experience in a sort of remote delivery system, but it's just very different.
Okay.
We've also videoed like actual workshops, and again, they are not good to watch.
Yep.
Here's another question that just came in. How do you deal with the wide variety of participants? How do you keep it interesting? That is a self-taught sysadmin if the pace is to be slow enough for a complete novice.
Sure. The first response is you can't, right? So we use pre-assessment questionnaires to try to figure out who's going to be in the room, and we will occasionally say this is too basic for you or this is too advanced, but normally we are on the side of caution and say this is too basic for you. The second thing that we do is, where possible, we'll run 2 rooms side by side. Now the logistics are more complicated, but if you've got any kind of a sorting hat, then you can split the distribution in the middle and put the complete novices in one room and those people who've got some sort of a starting point in another, and then run the 2 rooms at different speeds. So where we're able to do that, we do, because it's very effective. The third strategy is that as early as possible, you identify in the room those people who are advanced enough that they're going to be bored, and you turn them into helpers, partly so that they won't be bored, but partly also they will learn from teaching other people. You might think you understand the shell until you have to explain something to a novice, and that forces you to rethink it, or there's something that they've stumbled on that you've never seen before. And the fourth thing, which is always the hardest, is to tell instructors you can't help everybody. If you've got 40 people in the room and 2 of them are struggling, either you let down 2 people or you let down 38. And you just have to live with the fact that we can't help everybody all of the time. Those are the strategies we've used. Tracy?
Yeah, definitely if you see someone a little more advanced, having them be engaged and helping the person next to them. Part of this emergence of data carpentry was to help with this issue, to sort of give the novices a place to go to let software carpentry sort of go back to its roots of helping people who already have done at least some programming. So we're kind of trying to develop these workshops that will sort of naturally divide the audience. So yeah, that is a challenge. We're explicit in data carpentry, and every announcement is designed for people with no computational experience, so that if people show up, at least they should be aware of what the pitch is supposed to be. I will say that whenever people show up, even with more experience, they do learn something. A few things, tips and tricks. I learn something, I think, every time I teach. So you definitely gain something, but right, managing expectations, I would say, is step 1. And then, but we still, no matter what, within the same workshop, get too fast, too slow, just right. Every time, because even a novice that comes in, sometimes people will pick it up quickly. Some people will just be still trying to sort of figure out file structures within their computers. So being friendly, having people help each other, managing expectations.
Okay, very fair. Are there any other questions for the speakers from the audience? Well, I'll hang on for a minute just to see if there is, but I'd like to thank you both for sharing this information. For those that are tuned in, we will be making this into a YouTube video, so you'll be able to go back and review things and look at the slides, and we'll be publishing the link to that video on the SIGHPC education website, which is sighpceducation.acm.org, if you don't know that. And that will be freely available, and hopefully I'll get that done within the next couple of days. I see no. Yes, go ahead, Teresa.
I was going to say, if people have questions, they can email us directly
Please.
or via the email addresses on our websites. And I think we also have our slides up on SlideShare or variants of this. So happy to share just the slides with you as well.
Terrific. Well, thank you both, both again. And with that, then we'll adjourn the meeting. And thank you so much again for appearing today. I think it was a very interesting and a valuable talk.
Well, thanks.
Thank you for
We
having
really
us.
appreciate it.
Okay.
All
Bye-bye,
right.
everybody.
Take care. Thank you.
Mhm.
Have a good.
Bye.
Bye-bye.